The wind bullied the pines until they leaned, as if even the dead were listening. Richard Hartwell had spent a lifetime buying certainty, but all his money couldn't purchase the sound that escaped his chest when he saw the woman kneeling at his son's grave with a child pressed to her side. It wasn't grief that staggered him in that instant. It was the question, how could his son have left more behind than a headstone? Before we begin, if stories like this speak to your heart, feel free to share where you're watching from. It's always moving to see how far a story can travel. Enjoy. Chapter 1, The Boy Under the Pines. Graceland Cemetery wore its winter like a second skin, bruised sky, brittle grass, the sharp handwriting of leafless branches against the clouds. Richard's bodyguards hesitated at the gate, reading the room the way they'd been trained to read rooms, measuring threat, direction, odds. He waved them off. Some terrains money couldn't stabilize, and grief was one of them. Daniel's grave was a polished slab, Hartwell granite, Hartwell name, Hartwell severity. Fresh lilies, white as exhaled breath, lay where Richard had placed them every year. But today, someone else had come before him. She was small, not frail, small the way a blade is small, precise and holding its shape against a world that dulls. The child beside her, 4, maybe 5, was the color of unanswered winters, cheeks too pale for youth. He clutched her coat fiercely, thumb hooked into a torn pocket. He wasn't crying. He was studying grief the way children learn weather, by standing in it. "Ma'am," Richard said, and he heard the cliff in his own voice. "May I ask who you are?" The woman turned. Her eyes were swollen to the point of translucence. She pulled the child behind her, reflex quick as breathing. "Who are you?" she asked, and then, recognizing his face the way everyone recognized his face, she straightened as if to meet a wave. "I'm Richard Hartwell," he said. "Daniel was my son." A tremor passed through her, the kind that starts somewhere you can't name and ends in your hands. Her voice faltered. "I was a friend of Daniel's." He had sat across mahogany boards and dismantled empires on the word friend. It was too small and too large, it was as precise as a blade. Richard felt his stare harden the way armor slides over skin. "A friend," he repeated. "From where?" "We met at a party," she said, looking away. Her voice fought its way through her throat. "Just friends." The wind went for the pines again. The child, those serious eyes, watched him like a telescope. Richard nodded once, an old habit of de-escalation he used with hostile investors. "What's your name?" She hesitated for a heartbeat, then, "Emily. Emily Brooks." "And the boy?" "Noah," she said, and the way she said it made the air knuckle around the syllable. The child leaned his cheek against her sleeve without looking away from Richard. "Mrs. Brooks," Richard said. That was when he realized she wore no ring. "We'll talk soon," he murmured, and his bodyguards, far enough to be tactful, close enough to be a promise, fell into step as he left the woman and the boy under the whispering pines. He didn't look back. He had learned too late that looking back is one way to break. Chapter 2, The room with no windows. His office at the Hartwell estate had windows from marble floor to carved ceiling, but grief still made it a room with no windows. The chandelier threw a cold geometry of light down onto the desk. Richard's fingers, which could flip empires and make bankers agree to unthinkable terms, tapped once, twice, then stilled. He lifted the phone. "David," he said when the investigator answered, voice crisp and sure, the voice you pay someone to have for you when yours is breaking. "I want everything on Emily Brooks, discreet, 3 days." David Lee didn't ask why. He had worked too close to too many Hartwells to ask why. "Yes, sir." "David," Richard added. "The boy." "Yes," David said softly. "I'll be careful." Richard hung up and turned toward the windows. The city was a constellation of lights refusing to acknowledge the cloud. He didn't reach for a drink. He was too old for anesthesia and too young for honesty, which left waiting. On the mantel, a photograph from a different weather. Daniel at 10, cheeks still soft, hair ridiculous. He'd carved his name with a stick into the wet sand of a beach on the east coast and scolded the tide for daring to erase it. "I'll build something even the ocean can't move," he'd announced, arms out, chin high. He had. His father had helped him. And underneath, the quiet truth no one at a Hartwell table spoke out loud: the more you build, the more the wind knows your name. Interlude. Emily before the storm. Emily waited for the bus at 6 a.m. with a coffee in a cracked mug because the ceramic remembered the heat better than paper did. She had survived a mountain town nobody wrote about twice, once by leaving, once by staying long enough to get good at leaving. On campus, she'd learned 2 languages, scholarship and hunger. She had started working 2 jobs the week her father died, 3 the week her mother followed. People supposed there was a third parent, the town, because it's easier to believe in collective parenting than collective neglect. Daniel had been the kind of brilliant that made people forgive arrogance. He'd asked her if she ever wanted to climb the clock tower at midnight to see the city breathe. She had said no. He had smiled like someone grateful for a boundary. He'd had that gift, that refusal to push until the other person broke. He hadn't needed to. People followed him. She hadn't. She had met him, which is different. They had fallen in love the way important things happen, quietly like a cup set back on a table. He had kissed her at the edge of campus beneath a single sickly pine that smelled like resin and winter, and they had laughed, breath clouding the cold air. Then he had left, fewer words than weather. He'd stood in the doorway with the apology of someone who knows apologies don't save anything. "It's not you," he had said, and she had felt herself split into 2 people, one who stood and nodded and one who fell. The morning sickness had been the first truth her body forced on her. It wasn't an illness, but it bowed her all the same. She had learned to work with one hand on the wall, save, scrub, study, repeat. When the doctor pointed at a monitor and said ventricular septal defect, she had nodded again, older than her age. The baby was small and fierce and the color of dawn. She named him Noah. In the beginning, she talked to him when she couldn't sleep. "He was a good man," she whispered into his hair. "He broke like a good man breaks, which is to say, in private." Chapter 3, the dinner with no appetite. The Hartwell dining table could seat 20 and still have room for ghosts. The chandelier was a galaxy. The silverware had its own monogram. The steak bled politely at the edges. Richard tasted nothing. "Rich," Michael said, skulking around the edges of concern the way younger siblings do when their older brother's face is unreadable. "You look like you ate the stock market. What is it?" Richard told them. Not everything, not his suspicion that the boy under the pines had Daniel's eyes, but enough, the woman at the grave, the sobbing, the little hand tugging at a coat hem. He felt the air alter. The Hartwells were good at weather. George, his cousin, who had always loved money the way drunk men love boats, too much, too soon into the rocks, leaned in. "It's a ploy," he said. "I've seen this play. Woman, child, grave. Someone wrote that script for her." Michael frowned. "We don't know that." "Vanessa would know," George said, and that name was a match casually struck near a gas leak. Vanessa Carter had been at their table for 1 year and 3 months. She came with perfect posture and impeccable lineage, the cousin of a senator, the goddaughter of a museum. She and Daniel had dated for 2 seasons, the kind of relationship that looked like a truce. When Daniel died, she became an echo in their halls, grief making her both more and less visible. Richard's phone vibrated. He excused himself and stepped into the hall with its gallery of ancestral faces. "Uncle Richard," Vanessa's voice said, too eager to hide its pacing. "I heard about the woman." "How?" His voice sharpened before he could sand it down. "People talk," she said. "They call me. Daniel would have told me if he'd had some." She paused. "He never did, Uncle. There was no one else." She was trying to be cool. He remembered her at the funeral, white-knuckled, eyes like glass. He had thought then she loved him. He thought now she loved him. "Thank you," he said, and hung up. He leaned his forehead against the wood and made himself think. He had paid a man for facts. Pity and suspicion would have to wait their turn. Chapter 4, the report with a pulse. On the 3rd day, David's voice came as if from a courtroom. "I have something, sir." Emily Brooks, 28, born to a town that broke early, parents deceased, scholarships, part-time jobs, the ledger of survival, a small apartment in a building that wore its mold like a second choice. Employment, marketing assistant, left suddenly. Hospital receipts that fanned out like a paper storm, pediatric cardiology, imaging, medication, oxygen. A pediatric chart with a diagnosis that meant the heart had a door it shouldn't have. Photographs, Emily alone in the elevator, in the lobby with an overfull bag of groceries. Then another photo, grainy security footage that caught a luxury car waiting at a curb and a version of Daniel that Richard recognized, the slightly tilted head, the softness that crept into his mouth when he thought no one was watching. Emily getting in. 2 days later again. A pattern. "She never posted him," David said. "Not on the socials, no visible leverage, no friends mentioning Hartwells. She quit when the boy got worse. Mr. Hartwell, she walks the boy to the bus stop every morning, rain or not." Richard stared at the glass and saw a reflection he didn't like. "Set up a meeting," he said. "Now." He didn't wear the expensive Sorrow that day when he went to her building. He wore a sweater that might have been simple if it didn't fit so well. The hall smelled like bleach and something sweet trying to hide underneath. The paint flaked in curls big enough to write on. Emily opened the door as if expecting a bill. Noah sat cross-legged on the carpet, concentration of fierce halo. His toy was a hospital bear, one arm missing, the fur rubbed thin where comfort had been extracted. "I want to talk." Richard tried on a smile, and to his surprise it didn't break on his face. "If that's okay." Emily moved aside. Her eyes tracked his shoes like they were a threat. He sat. He told her everything he had learned, and at the end he did something he did with almost no one. He waited. She tried to keep her hands still. It made them shake more. "I didn't want this," she said. "I didn't want any of this. I loved your son. He broke up with me and I believed him when he said it was for the best because people like you don't tend to lie about their best." Noah stood with his bear on his shoulder, a soldier at ease, listening. "When I found out about the baby, I kept him because I couldn't unloving your son after he left. I could only learn a new way of loving him." She swallowed. "I thought that would be enough. It wasn't." The hospital, her hand went to the stack of receipts like a reflex. "I work nights, I take gigs. Sometimes I talk to him." Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, too careful to flick toward the grave. She didn't want to give Richard leverage. "I went to the cemetery because I thought maybe someone was listening." The world was full of nights that cancel out your learning, he thought. There was not one thing he had built that could stand the weight on that red folder. "He's Daniel's." His voice was low. He would have bet his life and all his spin on the answer. He asked anyway. She put her palm on Noah's hair with a tenderness that made him look away. "Yes," Richard nodded once, and when he spoke, his voice had the bone-deep steady of a man holding a beam after the house breaks. "Then he's a Hartwell. We will take care of the surgery and everything after. I'm sorry you had to carry this alone. It is dangerous, with certain people, to let them be decent. Their decency is richer than other men's because they have had so much practice at its counterfeit." Emily studied him the way you study a lion that has decided, inexplicably, not to eat you. Noah tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered, covering his mouth theatrically, "is this my grandpa?" His heart was too small and too loud for the room. Richard laughed, a startled sound like a bird in a room. "I don't know yet, son, but I'd like to be." Emily's eyes flooded, and because she had promised herself she would not cry again, she turned away and pretended to rearrange the stack of receipts. The dam gave one crack and then held. Richard's phone rang. "Michael." "Rich," he said, "you need to come home. Now." Chapter 5, The Storm with Cameras. Vanessa Carter didn't cry easily. When she cried on camera, it was a sculpture. Clean lines, one controlled tear, lashes trembling. She wore white, and there was a string of pearls at her throat that an older man had given her when she was 18. The backdrop was a hotel conference room with carpeting that swallowed footsteps. A dozen microphones waited like beaks. She spoke about love and loyalty and a woman pretending to be someone's tragedy. She showed text messages, real ones, stitched into a different story. She showed photographs, cropped to remove their context. She did it all with a voice that sounded like a prayer said on the wrong day. The reactions were instantaneous. Comment sections were wars with spells. The Hartwell phone lines flashed like emergency exits. The company's stock price, which had understood loss in theory, started learning it live. In the family room, George was triumphant. "You see," he said, his trumpet blare disguised as concern, "this is what happens when you toy with jackals, they bite." Michael was pale. He touched Richard's shoulder. "We can fix this," he said. "We can." Richard's face was the side of a mountain. He called the legal team. He called PR. He called David. He told the lawyer to draft a cease and desist and told PR to say nothing. He asked David for the one thing that dissolves poison proof. That night, he stood alone in his office and slid open the bottom drawer of his desk. There, in a little box that had once held cufflinks, lay Daniel's watch. He lifted it out. It still ticked, little heart that didn't know who it was keeping time for anymore. He pressed his thumb to the back of it, against the inscription no one knew he had engraved. "For you, my boy, for time you won't get." He made a decision then that money had told him 1,000 times it knew better than to make. He would not let the market, or the uncles, or the cousins tell him what family was. Chapter 6. The paper that weighed more than it should. The hair had been taken from Noah's brush by a woman who worked for a man who worked for David. The lab could have been a cathedral for how careful they were with it. The paper arrived 3 days later. crisp, clinical, indifferent to the drama it delivered. Richard held it like a verdict. 99.99%. The numbers were obscene in their certainty. He thought then of Daniel trying to nurse a latte in his dorm and laughing at a professor who insisted that math was a comfort. A comfort, he had said, mock serious, to those who understand it, to everyone else, a gun. He gathered the family. He laid the paper on the table like an offering and said the truth out loud. The room changed shape. Some people mean well when they say they agree, but what they mean is they will not oppose you in public. George was quickest to find his footing. Well, he said, if the boy is ours, then the money is ours. The money is the boy's, Michael said quietly. What is the difference? George snapped. Heartbeat, Richard said, his voice cut through the clamor. He is not a spreadsheet. They argued anyway. This is what powerful families do when faced with a powerless child. They redefine the child as a dynasty problem or a public relations crisis. Emily was outside under the rain, deciding which umbrella kept her drier, the one with holes or the one with a broken spine. In the days that followed, George reached out to men he had no business knowing and made promises he had no right making. Vanessa, humiliated publicly and privately, reached out to people who owed her favors and cashed them like checks. The stock price fell with a steady, almost elegant collapse. A whisper campaign bloomed in the shadow of major news. The Hartwell Foundation Gala, scheduled for the end of the month, was quietly cancelled for the first time in 20 years. Richard hardly slept. He ate what his sister-in-law pushed at him without tasting it. He spent hours on the phone with the legal team and with a faction of the board that remembered his father more fondly than him. Michael sat with him through midnight, silent, like a lighthouse. One thing at a time, Michael murmured when the hours got too blue. You taught me that remember, one thing at a time. The next morning, Emily arrived at the Hartwell estate, hair wet, jacket thin. The butler, Alden, who had more love for the family than sense sometimes, hustled her in and wrapped a towel around her shoulders like she was one of his own. She clutched a worn folder, the edges softened by years of taking it out and putting it away. This is from Daniel, she said when she stood before them, raw and not ashamed. He asked me to keep it until someone needed to know. Richard took the folder with hands that knew how to sign a deal that would steal into law. He opened it and saw a hand he had known since the first-grade school recital when Daniel wrote his name in shaky capitals on the program. Daniel's, years older, angles sharper. There were pages. A letter, a will. In it, Daniel admitted what he hadn't admitted to anyone else. He was sick. The doctors had given it beautiful names that meant the body was teaching him about grief. He had broken up with Emily because he thought he could stop a second suffering at the cost of his own. He had set aside money for her, for the baby. He had not told his father because Hartwells did not tell their fathers certain kinds of news. He had written, in a paragraph whose margins were dog-eared from rereading, that his biggest fear wasn't death. It was leaving someone unprotected. Attached were bank transfers, careful, quiet, uncharacteristic of a boy who threw money around like confetti for friends' birthdays. The money wasn't enough. Nothing ever is. Richard set the papers down and sat hard. The room blurred. He had the awful sensation of being right and unforgivably late. He stood up again. His voice returned like something rescued. Emily, I am sorry. I did not protect you. I didn't protect him. I will not repeat those mistakes. She nodded once only, and saw then in his eyes what she had needed to see, not pity, not strategy. Grief lit from the inside by resolve. Chapter 7, the press conference that bent the light. They held it in the Hartwell atrium because truth should not be whispered in small rooms. The press gathered like weather. The lights were machinery. Emily stood to the side. Noah was at the hospital for observation, and Alden sat in a chair next to him, telling him stories about ships. Richard walked to the podium with Daniel's watch under his cuff, a tiny weight, a map. He spoke not like a CEO but like a father who has learned to admit when he is wrong. He put Daniel's letter on the screen, with redacted data as needed, and the journalists, sharks and poets, fell quiet. He produced evidence that Vanessa had manipulated images, had paid for online farms to churn up lies like wheat. He didn't say her name the way some men would, with a relish that tastes like revenge. He said it the way you say the truth in an emergency room, quick and clean, so you can focus on the person on the table. The narrative flipped so fast it gave whiplash. Comment sections flooded with apologies dressed as explanations. Shares ticked up an inch. It was not enough. But sometimes an inch is the difference between sinking and climbing onto a step. Vanessa watched the coverage alone in a too-bright hotel room, makeup wiped off with a hotel towel, eyes swollen. She would say later that no one had warned her that grief was a hunter's trick. The music soft, and then the trap. She put her phone down and pressed her palms to her eyes, and for the first time since the funeral, let herself howl. Then she called a man named Victor Marlowe. Chapter 8. The coup. With a smile, Victor Marlowe ran a rival conglomerate with the smooth efficiency of a man who collected souls as a hobby. George met him in a private club that smelled like leather and legitimacy. They shared a drink that tasted like borrowed power. "You can save the company," Victor told George gently. "All you have to do is help it fall." He proposed a share buyback scheme that would destabilize Hartwell's cash flow. He promised media support in return for boardroom influence. He painted the picture of a Hartwell brand, tidier, cleaner, minus the inconvenient attachments. They moved fast. The next month, Hartwell's major project, a medical tech partnership, stalled because a mid-level manager delayed a permit. Another project broke its schedule because the architect, under pressure, misplaced tiles. Money bled from small arteries. The board whispered. Richard played triage. He pulled emergency funds from a dormant account. He sold a property he loved. He called every shareholder who had ever called him back. He slept in his suit. He lost 4 pounds. Emily watched him and did what people like her have always done when standing in front of a house fire without water. They went looking for neighbors with buckets. One of Emily's professors, back in university, had been a woman named Iris Kwan, who taught strategy as if it were ethics. Iris had become an investor who said no more than she said yes, and who turned down bigger names than Hartwell. Emily called her and asked for time. Iris gave her 20 minutes. They met in a cafe with plants cascading down the wall and coffee so serious it made apologies before being poured. Emily didn't speak like a CFO. She spoke like a mother whose child needed a surgery that would rewrite his life, like a woman who knew the company was not just jobs and steel, it was a family name she had learned to pronounce like a memory. Iris didn't smile. She didn't do the softness thing. She asked questions that were weapons, and Emily parried them with answers that were survival. Then Iris asked, "Why should I believe you won't drown me?" "Because," Emily said, voice lifting something heavy, "if you invest, you won't be investing in Hartwell's lies. You'll be investing in our truth. We're about to build something that can't be bought, credibility paid for in public confession. That's worth something. Also," and here she allowed herself a small, fierce smile, "I won't let the boy grow up believing people are only as good as their net worth." Iris looked at her for a long time, then nodded once, as if giving permission to gravity. Vanessa heard about the meeting within the hour and swung all the borrowed weapons she had left. A new smear campaign exploded across feeds. The angle was different now, more sophisticated. The narrative wasn't gold digger, it was unqualified liability. People called Emily the company's Achilles heel. Richard and Emily worked overnight building a document with more references than a legal textbook, dismantling each claim, attaching receipts like locust wings. The next morning, Iris Kwan signed a letter of intent and agreed to a capital injection contingent on governance reforms. Hartwell didn't drown, not yet. George, sensing momentum shift, laced panic into new plans. He bribed a subcontractor, he leaked meeting notes. The company bled but refused to hemorrhage. Richard's legal team moved like wolves. They caught Vanessa in a lie she couldn't climb out of. She settled a lawsuit for defamation with a statement that read like scripture and tasted like sand. The stock climbed 2 steps. Chapter 9, the room where hearts are opened, the hospital room where they prepped Noah for surgery, was painted a color that tried too hard. The surgical nurse had eyes like afternoons and a voice that erased some of the edges. Emily signed papers like spells. Her hand shook only once. Richard stood awkwardly until he didn't. He reached into his pocket and took out the watch. "It's too big," he said, voice a little too bright, "but would you hold this for me? It was your dad's. If you take care of it, it'll tell you what time it is after." He didn't say after what. Noah's eyes lit up in a way that made something in Richard's chest quit and then start again. "It ticks," he whispered, as if animals could be in there. "Everything important ticks," the nurse said, and she was right. Emily leaned down and pressed her forehead to her son's. "If you get scared," she whispered, "picture the pine trees." He looked puzzled. She smiled. They make wind look kind. The surgery took 4 hours and a lifetime. In the waiting room, Richard sat with Emily and discovered that waiting with someone who can lose what you can't replace is a different kind of waiting. Michael brought bad coffee and better jokes. Alden prayed in the manner of butlers, in silence, with dignity, with ridiculous sincerity. When the surgeon came out, he was tired and luminous. "It went well," he said. "His heart will make a different kind of sound now, less struggle, more music." The room exhaled in 3 different ways and one. That night, Richard stood at the window of the hospital, watching the city pulse. He did not thank any gods. He thanked timing and skill and money that had finally done what money is supposed to be for. Chapter 10. The table with a reckoning. The shareholder meeting took place in a room that could have been a chapel if pews were chairs and prayers were slide decks. Victor Marlowe wore a tie that looked like a threat. George wore his remorse like cologne, heavy, performative, nauseating. Richard didn't come with a lawyer. He came with papers. He came with evidence of collusion, bribery, sabotage. He came with emails whose subject lines read like confessions and contracts whose clauses smelled like smoke. He came with Iris Kwan at his side, her stillness a weapon. He spoke like a man who had been to the hospital. He didn't say legacy, he said. "My son's watch is missing 2 nicks that I remember because I was there when he fell off his bike." He said, "This company exists because a child once drew his name in sand and dared the tide to do its work." He said, "I will not let greed be the only author of our future." Slowly, seat by seat, hands that had been poised to drift toward the easy evil of a quick profit turned toward something older and steadier. Victor Marlowe's smile thinned. He made a speech with all the right words and none of the soul. It didn't land. The vote that followed removed George from the board. It didn't erase his damage. It did erase his immediate power to do more. George left the room with his head low. He sat in his car and practiced how to say "I'm sorry" to men who measured apologies in years and dollars. He cried. No one saw. Vanessa received notice of legal consequences that would follow her for a while. Eventually, the media would find a new meal. She would go back to a life that had less gold in it and more quiet. In that quiet, she might learn why she had done what she had done. Or not. Not all truths are found, some are only looked at. Chapter 11. The house with more names on the mailbox. Rebuilding is less cinematic than destruction. It is duplicate emails and coffee tastes like paper, long meetings and short tempers, mistakes forgiven, excellence rewarded. The reforms Iris insisted on made the company more porous to the future, a whistleblower line that actually worked, a fund set aside for employee emergencies, a flexible schedule that didn't treat humanity as the enemy of productivity. The family council met and finally sounded like a family. Richard spoke and didn't need to raise his voice. "We've punished people for needing us," he said. "We mended an image, but more importantly, we mended something with a pulse." Emily didn't become a Hartwell in one day. She became one the way marble becomes smooth, touch by touch. She came to the office twice a week, slipping into meetings she had no right to understand and understanding them anyway. She started a foundation in Daniel's name for families with children who can't afford the sound of their own hearts being fixed. She called it Project Lighthouse because there are places where the dark is a shoreline. Michael signed on as a board member. Alden donated half his pension and cried when no one was looking. George asked to address the family. He stood in the great room where generations of portraits watched and did the hardest thing he'd ever done. "I wanted to be important," he said, voice breaking. "I thought I could cheat certainty into loving me. I was wrong. Give me a broom." He meant it. They gave him a job that mattered less than his old one and more. Noah learned how to run without listening to his own heart for instruction. He ran too far the first week and brought back a collection of scraped knees to prove his training. Richard showed him which trees to avoid and which ones made wind look kind. One evening, when the house smelled like rosemary and there was laughter in the hall, Noah climbed into Richard's lap as if it had always been empty for him. He pressed his ear to the ticking under Richard's cuff and whispered, "It's like Dad's watch is in your arm." "A bit," Richard said. "A lot." Chapter 12. The morning that refused to forget spring arrived with the dramatics of a diva, magnolias fat with bloom, sunlight that made everything look like a promise. They drove to the cemetery without a security detail and with pastries. Flowers had replaced the lilies, wild ones in colors Daniel would have pretended not to know the names of. He would have known. Richard knelt. Stone is not cold if you bring your own warmth to it. He pressed his palm to Daniel's name and felt the nothing that sometimes, if you're lucky, becomes a something, permission. Your boy is strong, he said. He runs like he learned from time. He did not talk about the board or the stock price or the men who tried to eat them alive. He talked about Noah's favorite book, about the way Emily laughs when she is so tired she forgets to be careful, about Project Lighthouse and the first check they wrote to a woman who had worn her hope thin. He talked about forgiveness, and he did not say whether it was for Daniel or himself. Emily stood beside him with Noah's hand of 5 years, now 5 and a little, which is a very different age, soft in hers. Her other hand held a flower with too many petals for its stem. We made it, she said simply. We didn't deserve the storm, but the sky cleared anyway. Noah stepped forward and stared at the engraving. The photograph, behind its small pane of glass, had Daniel in that college-year grin, half bashful, half the sun. Noah's mismatched ears angled toward the stone, listening. He set the watch on the base of the grave for a moment, like kids do when they want to show and give at the same time. Daddy, he said with the solemnity of those who think they might be overheard by the right ears, I'm going to be a good boy. I get tired less now. I can help Mom carry things, and I can help Grandpa not be sad. No one taught him the holy shape of his words. Kids are liturgy we don't earn. Richard put a hand on the boy's shoulder and felt the life under his palm. He looked at Emily and saw, not the girl from the report, not the woman at the grave, but someone with a spine like a lighthouse, upright, held together by storms. He had no words big enough. He didn't need them. He took their silence and made it a vow. On the way back to the car, the wind came for the pines, and for once the pines held their ground. Tiny cones rolled underfoot, grenades for squirrels, gifts for children. Noah collected 3 and gave one to Richard. For your desk, he said, so Daniel has a tree. Days later, in the office with windows pretending to be sky, Richard placed the pinecone between Daniel's watch and a photograph of the first Project Lighthouse family to send a thank you, the child's hand traced in crayon on construction paper. He read a line from Daniel's letter again, not because he had forgotten, but because some griefs benefit from being invited back in light. I hoped for a kind father. I got you. The city moved outside his window, full of mirth and breath and people telling each other stories to make sense of it. He thought of the first day at the grave, everything sharp, nothing sure, and of this one. The arc between them wasn't smooth. It was not a cinematic montage softened by music. It was ugly and beautiful and hard as a stone that has caught every storm and learned to offer itself up to hands anyway. When he left that evening, he switched off the light and didn't care that the room looked like a stage going dark. Outside, the moon was a thin watch, keeping time for anyone who bothered to look. He drove a car that was too quiet to a house that was too large and opened a door that sounded like welcome. In the kitchen, Emily measured flour for cookies and Noah tried not to spill milk and Michael and Alden argued about the correct way to fold napkins. The radio murmured a song that had lived longer than any of them. Someone had brought flowers, wild as spring. Someone had left a window open. Richard stood in the doorway and, for the first time in years, believed in the future as something other than a business plan. Grief had not left him. It had rearranged him. He walked toward it, the way you walk toward the people you love when they call your name. Before bed, he sat at his desk and wrote 3 sentences on a piece of stationery with the Hartwell crest faded by the years. He didn't date it. He addressed it to Daniel. He folded it once and slid it inside the watch box. He did not lock the drawer. The house slept around him. Outside, the pines, those stubborn witnesses, refused to forget. Sometimes the richest man in the city finds out he is a poor man in the only currency that matters and then learns to make a different investment. Sometimes a woman goes to a grave to talk to a man who isn't there and finds a family waiting. Sometimes a boy's heart makes a new sound and the world rearranges itself to listen. And sometimes, not often, a story ends without a happily ever after and still refuses to be tragic. In the morning, the sky pretended it had never learned to be overcast. The light came in like forgiveness. They went to work. The watch ticked. The pinecone did its unglamorous work of holding memory in potential. $1 billion circled the planet. A boy ran in the yard with his sleeves rolled up. Somewhere in a town on a mountain nobody writes about twice, a girl put her hand on her chest and marveled at the steady sound it made. The wind moved through the trees. The names on the mailbox were one more than they had been, and the future, shining with all its inconvenient demands, waited for them to step into it together.